It's October and it's time for the monthly update. There's always a ton of stuff going on in the watch world, and I've curated some news that I thought was interesting and worth sharing. There are a couple of new watches, especially because of Geneva Watch Days. There's a shocking, mind-blowing report that I have to share with you, and there are some other bits and doodads that are worth talking about. Let's dive in. Tudor released something. They do that sometimes. And this time it's for the 1926 line, and it's a moon phase. I've got a strong opinion on this one, and in fairness, I have not had hands-on with this watch yet, but the 1926 is not the most popular offering from Tudor, at least not in the West. The moon phase is also not a strong offering, and it's not necessarily about the aesthetics, but it does play a part. Tudor's best at dive watches and sports watches. The regular Black Bay without dive bezel is a good entry Aquaterra type watch. The 1926 though is one of those kind of dressy but not really dressy watches that just looks like a mall watch to me. Oh, and there's always somebody that likes it. No, this is my opinion. I don't like it. If you like it, cool, but I don't. Longines have a better option. Tissot has the Le Locle and the Pro 100 that are both better aesthetically as far as I'm concerned. Maybe you love this design, but for me, it's one of the very weakest links in the Tudor lineup. I also acknowledge, and the choice of brand ambassador makes this clear, this watch is aiming for Asian audiences more than Western. These kinds of styles do better over there. Just like the Constellation from Omega, which in the West, by a lot of people who seen as kind of a meh watch, is quite popular in Asia and Southeast Asia. This lineup, the 1926, is also one that appeals to women, and I'd say, in the lineup's defense, it works better as a women's watch. Although I would probably still choose a Longines flagship, classic or elegant, over the 1926 any day of the week. But anyway, these versions, based on photos alone, feel flat, and specifically I have serious questions about the contrast between the moon and the disk above the moon. From what I can see, I see a lack of contrast and a lack of depth. 3 examples of what I'm talking about. There's the Cartier Drive moon watch. It's a completely different price range, but that price isn't because of the ability to contrast the color of the moon and with the subdial. Here, the design makes the moon stand out. Second, Christopher Ward. It's a different approach, roughly the same price range, but there's much more contrast, much more depth. Raymond Weil has a watch that does a better job on the specific subdial layout. With a moon phase, you either have to give some sort of depth to the moon or work with some colors that contrast it to the subdial it's inlaid beneath. If you don't, your watch ends up looking flat and like a mall watch. I think I understand Tudor's aesthetic reasoning. They want tonal consistency and not too much that stands too much out. But this is just a flat dial. The exception is maybe the gold dialed version, which has some level of contrast, but still it seems to lack a level of depth. Then there's the second problem, which is more of a personal one in terms of positioning. And I'm going to be a teeny tiny bit pedantic here. We've got dress watches. Dress watches are restrained watches, usually on leather straps. That's, the Master Control ultra thin. And it's the 1926 on a strap, potentially. On the other end of the scale, we have sports watches. These are the Aquaterras and the Black Bays. They are usually a bit more polished than dress watches. They have a little bit more bulk, typically. They are often a little bit more eye-catching with stuff like sunray dials. They always come on steel bracelets. Dress watches, objectively, don't sell as well as sports watches. Watches on straps don't sell as well as sports watches. This is why the Nomos Club now has a sport version with a bracelet. It's to appeal to more customers. It's why the IWC Pilot Mark 20 has a steel bracelet. It's built to appeal to more customers with that steel bracelet. And that often works. But sometimes you get something that just is neither here nor there. Personally, I think the IWC Portuguesa shouldn't be offered on a steel bracelet. But they do because it becomes more sporty, and therefore it becomes more commercially viable. And that's what they've done with the 1926 as well. And I don't think it works. It's a great bracelet, but this watch is just one that works best without a bracelet. The 1926 with opaline dial and blued hands with a leather strap is the best one of the bunch, and I really like that watch. All the steel bracelet versions are just not as good. And in my opinion, it's because it's a compromise watch, and it just isn't a watch that should be flaunting a steel bracelet. But that's not the main problem either. Tudor has full in-house capabilities. And what do they do here? They bought a Sellita movement and spiffed it up. There's nothing wrong with Sellita. The SW280 is a decent workhorse movement from Sellita. Tudor has added upgrades, and it should be adjusted to chronometer standards, which notably isn't COSC certified. But this movement is a problem for me for 2 clear reasons. Müller Glashütte have the Teutonia 4 moon phase. It's a little bit cheaper than the Tudor. It doesn't have a steel bracelet, but for everything else, it's entirely a competitor. And as far as I'm concerned, it's aesthetically superior by a million miles. And you know what they've done? They've also taken the SW280 and upgraded it to make the Müller version of the 280. It's not unique to Tudor. So Müller are doing largely the same for less. But most importantly, Tudor has Kinesi. There's nothing wrong with the SW280, but when you literally have your complete, fully in-house manufacturer with watchmakers that are capable of making METAS standard movements, why? Why do you not allow just one of them to spend some time and make a Tudor unique movement? And I'll tell you why. Because that would be too expensive, and that's fine when you're Main or Baltic or Furlan Mari. Tudor is allowed to be value conscious, but so value conscious that they don't even bother to say, let's make our own movement. Yeah. I mean, for the small volumes they move of the 1926, it would probably be a bad business decision. But honestly, I see it also as a bad business decision to choose the easiest and laziest solution, specifically because Tudor, of all brands, should have the skill to do this themselves. I mean, for crying out loud, I don't expect them to put a Rolex movement in their watch, but Rolex does have the schematics for a moon phase from the Cellini. Look over their shoulders or something, be inspired. I mean, this is just lazy, and I don't care if it's a way to make it a value offering. If it were just a great value offering, the totality of this watch is just half-assed. It's so in between lines. It's like, yeah, we're just going to do this at the end of the lifespan of the 1926 before we come out with something new, just to create a little bit of hype. And it's just, it's marketing at its worst. If you are enjoying this content, and by you watching this far into the video, you probably are, then if you're also new here, please click the subscribe button. It makes a huge difference for the channel. I love the support. And also, if you have time, leave a comment and a like. Thanks a ton. There's apparently this site called Collectorsphere, which is a forum for 200 collectors across the world. But they did a survey, which a lot of other sites have referred to, so I guess I can too. Basically, they asked some people some things about the industry, and one of the key insights was, and I quote, "Many expressed skepticism about brands' ability to justify price increases, with few seen as offering meaningful value." And another quote, "Collectors are increasingly seeking brands that offer more. They want meaningful connection, transparency, and storytelling rooted in horological authenticity." So let me translate this. People think price increases are BS, especially when the product doesn't get better. I think this might be the moment. I'm going to become a consultant for watch brands. For a flat fee of 1 million euros per consultation, I will tell you what's wrong with your business. Number one, make watches people actually want. Don't rip people off. How is this groundbreaking news? Do you think Zenith's leadership is sitting in the office and thinking, I wonder why people won't buy our limited edition lapis lazuli calendar watch, which is priced $8,000 or 50% higher than the regular model, despite the only difference being lapis lazuli? This happens in every industry. People want your product, and then you get lazy. You try to optimize for cost, and you push the price to see where the breaking point is, and inevitably, there's a backlash. How about just making good products? I've got a soft spot for Zenith. I like a lot of their watches. I have the A384. The Pilot is a favorite of mine. The Chronomaster lines are not just iconic, but I also actually like a lot of them just on their own merits. I even have a really soft spot for the Defy Extreme Chronos with the chronograph that is operated with its own separate barrel. This time around, they released the Zenith Defy Chronograph USM. For $11,800, you get a steel chronograph, a brushed ladder-style bracelet like the one on the A384. There are 4 models, blue, green, orange, and yellow. Inside, you have the Defy El Primero 400, 5 Hertz, 50 hours of power reserve, 37 millimeter case diameter. It has a lugless design. The Defy Chronograph USM combines the octagonal case and something of the Defy A36, the orange one that came out last year, I think, with all the polished facets you'd expect to find on USM's chrome tubes and iconic ball joints. USM, by the way, is a furniture manufacturer. I didn't know them. This was a limited edition of 60 pieces, and they are apparently already all sold out. So in a sense, it's not really worth talking about. But I just wanted to rant about making watches people like and pricing them right. So I thought, well, if this was non-limited, would it sell? And before answering that question, I have to say, I don't like this watch at all. I obviously love the A384, but the A36, XX case is not one I like that much. The octagonal case does not appeal to me at all. It's a small watch that is incredibly blocky in its style. The ladder bracelet, which I think works in some settings, on the A384 does, feels a step too far on those models. To me, there's just way too much going on, and adding a chronograph with the 3 overlapping subdials is just overkill. I don't like it. I haven't seen these chronos in the metal, but I really doubt I would change my mind. But would they sell? Let's start with the price. That's halfway between a Speedmaster from Omega and a Daytona from Rolex. The movement is a 5 Hz El Primero movement with 50 hours of power reserve. It's not METAS or COSC certified, but it should have an accuracy, around the COSC S range. 5 Hz and high accuracy is not easy to attain, especially not in a chrono. There are all sorts of compromises and complications in terms of consistency of power, torque delivery, but it does still feel like a steep premium for what is ostensibly a high beat rate and an automatic. Finishing wise, it's going to be comparable. The water resistance is better than a Speedy, but considering it was a diver case originally, 100 meters seems off. But Zenith does this all the time. They're not like Omega, who insist that a dive watch should have dive specs. For Zenith, the case is just a canvas on which they can create. Those kind of specs, though, are secondary. The bracelet is objectively worse. I own it. Compared to the pure features of the new Speedy bracelet, this one is just outdated. In theory, that's on purpose because it's supposed to look retro. But long story short, $3,000 to $4,000 more than a Speedy is just really, really hard to justify. And then there's the aesthetic. Color is in the moment. The Top Time B31 is popular. So are colorful nose clubs. Tudor has had success with their new Daring line, which leans heavily into colorful dials. It's early autumn, so people aren't chronically deprived of vitamin D yet, so color will still appeal to people. But the case and bracelet, that's niche, super niche, and it's not ever going to be a mass consumer product. And this is for people who love Zenith and retro to the nth degree. It's also for people who take the path less traveled, because this is anything but a regular Speedy or a Daytona or a Hanhart or even a Chronomaster Sport. It's deliberately different. So mass market wise, this watch would never, ever, ever sell. And I think it would probably be even too niche for the collector crowd. Unsurprisingly, it's a limited edition then, because then you can say it's sold out with a moderately low release number. As a broader commercial product, it would be a close but no cigar watch. There would definitely, in my mind, be better options out there, honestly. And yes, they sold 60, but in a world of almost 8 billion people, 60 $12,000 watches is not going to raise an eyebrow. And it's a limited edition. Zenith do this too much. Limited edition lapis lazuli, limited edition blue ceramic Chronomaster Sport. They know these watches are too niche to have in a mass production run. There's just not desire for them at any meaningful scale. And I personally appreciate that Zenith has 3 priorities. They've got the mainstream consumer being served by the likes of the Chronomaster Sport, the Hublot consumer who wants watches like the Defy Stream, and the vintage collector who wants A384s and a watch like the USM. But I get this feeling that it also has its downsides. Zenith Art wants too mainstream to be weird, but also not weird enough to be the avant-garde choice. And they're Hublot-esque, but not really Hublot enough to really satisfy the Hublot-style customer. So they play in this weird no man's land, and it feels suboptimal. IWC has also gone the route of Rolex and launched IWC Curated, which is their version of Rolex Pre-Loved, or whatever they call it. I haven't seen actual watches yet, but it seems like IWC would initially like to be a little bit more selective with what's on offer. Rolex Pre-Loved basically only requires a watch to be more than 2 or 3 years old, but the way IWC positions Curated, it sounds like more of a selected process. And I would guess this is for a couple of reasons. I think a 4-year-old IWC Petit Prince chronograph isn't going to command a curated price. The curb tax on most IWCs is really steep. And I think the approach of buying anything used and then selling it at a markup way above what a grey market dealer is asking is just going to be a hard sell for IWC. It'll be a fair bit harder than it is for Rolex, who can usually convince people to charge more because their watches are hard to get a hold of new. So instead, IWC go for curated and try to have more in demand or hard to transparently price pieces in the catalog. But it is a sign that these brands see the grey market as both something they need to control to some extent and also can establish as a new revenue stream. You kind of have to do it these days. Small tariff update. There was a person in the comments 5 months ago that stated that tariffs would lead to the brands having to lower prices. 5 months later, no. Patek has raised prices, Omega, Swatch Group, Rolex, pretty much everybody anywhere between 15 and 6 to 10%. Breitling has announced they will have price increases. Cartier will also be increasing prices. It was only ever going to go one way, and that was up, and that's what's happening right now. I haven't always gelled with Frederique Constant. For the longest time, I felt they were dominated by an aesthetic of what I can only describe as old fart watches. The dials, the numerals, the cases all seemed a little bit bulbous and stodgy to me. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And especially the ones that got pushed in the watch medium. They had a classic world timer, which was a lot of watch for the money, but initial versions of it felt like a little bit Patek, but not good enough. to me. There was just this kind of cookie cutterness to them in their styling that wasn't, appealing to me. But that's been changing. The High Life is a great watch both in the World Timer and the Perpetual version. This month they've updated the Premier line with new dials and a new bracelet. And this watch is basically a stunner. 38.5 millimeters, 10.6 millimeters in thickness, lug width of 20 millimeters. Inside is the FC301 movement, which is a Lejeune Perret base with 68, 9, 70-ish hours of power reserve. This watch has a lot in common with a Vacheron 56 or a Baltic MR01 in terms of aesthetics. It's the Art Deco style with the wavy numeral. It's the railroad tracks on the inside and outside of the numerals. The center dial has a grained matte finish with the numerals track being a sunray finish. The watch is available with a blue and a pale salmon dial. The bracelet is a 5-link Jubilee style bracelet. It tapers from 20 millimeters at the lugs to 17 or 16 millimeters at the clasp. There's no quick release. The clasp itself is a deployant butterfly style bracelet, and 2,200 euros is the price. They are dress watches and they are sports watches. Dress watches are restrained and toned down and come on a leather strap. Sports watches are ever so slightly less restrained with sunray dials, more polish and steel bracelets. Dress watches come as super classic like the JLC Master Ultra Thin, and from there you get the more decorative, colorful, more relaxed versions. They are your sector dials and your smart casual watches that are identifiable by having, simply a bit more going on the dial, but ultimately they're still lean dressy. Dressy watches in today's market are relatively niche, and I think they've had a hard time moving stock. There's a reason Omega doesn't push the DeVille line as hard as they do the Aquaterra and the Moonwatch. The Frederique Constant Premier sits right in the middle of the space between dress and sport. It's more than a sports watch because it's got more of a decorative dial configuration, and it also doesn't have the more prominent bezel that you know from sports watches like the Aquaterra, the Chronomat, and the Datejust. It's also not a dress watch because of the steel bracelet and the Art Deco dial. That makes for a watch for a not quite mainstream consumer. The thing is, I'm pretty sure there's more volume in sports watches than there is in dress watches. I think there's more of an audience in dress watches with more interesting dials. And I think modern consumers gravitate towards watches with more visual interest, more color, and more personality. There's a reason why Rolex has Oyster Perpetuals in pastels. Omega has 1 million dial versions of the Aquaterra, and Nomos and Breitling, they prioritize color in their top time and club lineups. But on a leather strap, I just think these kinds of watches would sell worse. Put a bracelet on and you take a relatively niche dress style watch, and the watch, if done correctly, instantly becomes more interesting for the sports crowd. This isn't going to be quite mainstream and middle of the road like an Oyster Perpetual or an Aquaterra, but it's mainstream adjacent enough to not be too weird in terms of aesthetic. And that's what they've done here. They've taken a relatively niche, classic, dressy style watch and made some adjustments to the polish, the finish, the dial, and the bracelet to make it more appealing to more people. And for what it is, I think it's a really good option. The dial is gorgeous. It's also fresh and not too old-fashioned with no Roman numerals and oceans of Clou de Paris. It has a retro feel to it, but not further back in time that it will appeal to today's customers. The case is also much less bulbous than those Frederique Constant classics have sometimes been. Overall, I quite like it. I haven't yet had hands-on with this watch, but on my scale of grail to buy to shortlist to think about to better options out there, it's a clear think about it. Last watch. Another one I haven't had hands-on with, but I'm doing my best to get hands-on with it. Trilobe is a French brand based in Paris. I first noticed them last year at Watches and Wonder, where I had hands-on with the Nuit Fantastique models and a couple of others. They do a Ressence kind of thing where they don't go for hands, but rather display time in different circles. They have the Une Folle Journée, which sends my mind in the direction of MB&F. That's a 3D watch with a huge crystal and a lot of depth to the dial. That's for one kind of customer. And then there's the Nuit Fantastique, which I think is a fabulous watch which inhabits this dressy kind of space I was talking about before. And now they've essentially taken that idea and turned it into an integrated bracelet version, the 32. Like I said, I haven't had the 32 specifically, but the Nuit and the Folle Journée I have. And I want to share some thoughts about this watch and French watchmaking. First, France has multiple schools that train really good watchmakers. There's a school in Morteau, which is just over the border from Switzerland, near Le Locle, where Patek and Cartier, among others, have their manufacturers. There's also a school in Paris and a couple of other places. The French schools train their watchmakers for a minimum of 2 and up to 7 years in total, where the training both covers watchmaking, but also design and the commercial side of product development. This leads to some seriously skilled and talented young people graduating. These schools are incredibly hard to get into, and the talent that comes out of them is so high that Swiss brands jump at the chance of hiring these watchmakers. Up until recently, Trilobe developed their movements in collaboration with a French manufacturer of movements, Niamoto in short form, for the Nuit, where several of the watchmakers are educated from that local watchmaking school in Morteau. Most importantly, there's a high density of watchmaking talent in France, and because the watch industry itself in France is smaller, a lot of the talent ends up being independent and more focused on original things. If you get a job at IWC or Patek or Tag or whoever, your job as a watchmaker is inherently quite limited. You're doing the same thing all day long, and the room for creative expression at those big corporate brands is just inherently limited. Because the French side is smaller, a lot of these watchmakers just branch out and try to make it on their own. And it's from a lot of these smaller watchmakers that incredibly interesting ideas arise. Just as an example, Theo Offray, he went to that school in Morteau. Second, for this watch, they have developed, designed, prototyped, and produced their own movement. This isn't easy to do. It takes skill and experience, engineering understanding, and true creativity. And at a first glance, I think they've come up with a stunning design. I've been diving into modern French watchmaking recently, and what I've come to appreciate, and it shows in this watch, is that the French are not afraid to deviate from classic design conventions. This is something I place as a cubist or modernist design take, and I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know much about art, but you know, the balance bridge is very breguet when you come to think of it. You might think that thing is just a big square barrel bridge is a little bit weird, but that's not some compromise of production. It's a deliberate choice. So is the regulator triangle arm, and the finishing of the base plate is also a deliberate choice. The choice to build a movement that's so sparse in terms of gears and sort of doodads is a deliberate choice, and you can like it or not, but if you're into movements and you've seen your fair share of anglage and perlage and Côte de Genève and hand engraved swan neck regulators, this is something thoroughly different and worth of at minimum a second look. Trilobe have some people on their team with some real watchmaking vision. The third thing that got me thinking about, how do you make more money? You take a dressy watch and you make an integrated bracelet version. This one looks good. This is where you see that the commercial thinking that these brands also have to have. The Nuit and Une Folle Journée are great watches, but an integrated bracelet watch is just going to sell better. And fourth, on paper, this watch looks stunning. Based on my other experiences with the brand, the watches I have had hands-on, the case and the bracelet is going to be entirely competitive with mainstream offerings. My guess is that specifically the case and bracelet are made by a sub-supplier, but as I'm more and more coming to conclude, that makes it no better or worse than anything potentially made in-house. Fifth, there's going to be somebody in the comments that's like, oh, I can't buy this. You can't buy an untested movement. Give me a Sellita. Well, no. If we as a community want new things, we have to take chances. We can't scream that Sellita is boring on the one hand and then knock in-house movements on the other. These people are trying to go that extra mile to do something fully unique. That deserves praise. I suppose there's a more concise way of saying that. Basically, France has really good watchmakers. They're super creative and are fiercely independent. Trilobe have some people doing some really interesting non-traditionalist things that are deserving of respect. And this watch is likely going to do very well. You should pay attention to French independent micro brands and French watchmakers. Boom. Bless words. That's all I had this time around. Share your thoughts in the comments. Like, subscribe. Cheers.